Well, good evening, everyone. It's my real pleasure to welcome you here this evening and to have a talk about James McNeil, Whistler by Daniel Sutherland. Daniel and I met many years ago when we were part of the, we still are really part of the Chelsea Arts Club. And I don't know if you know, but Whistler was one of the founders of the Chelsea Arts Club. So we began the Whistler Society, and there's some information over there on the table, which you can look at afterward, if you like. And our mutual admiration for Whistler, the charismatic and somewhat cantankerous artist, grew and grew and grew. And so I invited Daniel to come this evening and talk to us. I do have some house etiquette that I have to read to you. This is my first time I've convened a talk here, so be patient with me. Please turn off your phones. We don't want any other extraneous messages coming through. In the case of a fire, it's a bit of a down way to start, but in case of a fire, proceed down the main staircase, leave the building through the front entrance, go over to Queen Square, and stand on the footpath and gather there. They have your names downstairs, and I suppose I'm supposed to be accountable for all of you, so please be good and do what you're supposed to do. Now, about Daniel. Forgive me if I read this. Daniel is a Midwesterner, as I am. You can maybe hear an American voice, from Chicago originally, but I've lived here for 40 years, and don't say it, my voice hasn't changed. No, it hasn't. He was born in Detroit, Michigan. He got his PhD from Wayne State University. He then taught for 44 years at Wayne State, the University of Alabama, the McNeil University, and the University of Arkansas, and he retired from the university in 2020. He spent 15 years compiling the biography on Whistler, which is over on the table, and which is available this evening for you to purchase, and he will sign for you afterward if you'd like to have a copy. He has written, in addition to Whistler, he's written on 19th century US Civil War history. That was his first passion. And then he wrote the book, A Life for Art's Sake, which we have here by Yale Press. He has published several essays on Whistler and given numerous talks about the artist in the United States. We were discussing before when we had dinner together, and we couldn't decide. It's a little bit like me. Is he an American? Is he English? Is he French? But anyway, he kind of got dual nationality. An American Whistler was who adopted Britain, but loved France the most, I think. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and Daniel will tell you all about that. He is currently the co-editor of the 10 O'Clock Journal, which is published by the Whistler Society. And I have copies of that over there as well. And I'd be happy to talk to any of you after the talk about joining the society, because we'd like to have you as members. Now, the subject tonight is, was Whistler a dandy? And I said, you know, he was charismatic, but he was cantankerous. But today we make it the inside story of, you know, how did he fashion himself? What is his legacy? I think Daniel said to me, one of the things that Whistler, I asked him, was he a happy man when he fulfilled his life? And he said, well, he thought of one thing. He wanted to know what the biographer would say about him. So perhaps he's listening tonight. I don't know. But anyway, Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, Sandra. And thank all of you for coming out on a night like this. And thanks to the Institute as well for inviting me to share some of my thoughts about James McNeil Whistler. I'd originally thought that I would talk to you about the connection between Whistler and Bath. I mean, it seemed logical to me. But as I began to investigate, I realized that I would not have much to tell you about Whistler and Bath. So far as we know, he stayed here only one time in his life. That was during the winter of 1901, 1902, from early December 1901 until early February 1902. And like many people at the time and today, he came for his health. He'd been suffering terribly in London that winter from what he called the British fog, meaning essentially the pollution, the air pollution in London. So he came here escorted by his mother-in-law and the youngest of several sisters-in-law, who were kind of looking after him after his wife had died about 5 years earlier. We know they stayed at 7 Marlborough Street, but that's about it. Whistler wrote several letters, had several correspondence, perhaps a better way to put it, when he was here. But he was talking mostly about business and upcoming exhibitions and things like that, and didn't say anything about what he was doing here, whether he was roaming the city, exploring, sketching the architecture, which would have been a natural for him. We do have 2 pieces of art he produced when he was here that might give us some indication. There were 2 lithographs. This one is of his mother-in-law, Frances Burney Phillip, who was the widow of a well-known Scots sculptor, John Burney Phillip. And the other one was of his sister-in-law. Louder, okay. I usually depend on the microphone, but are we all right now? Okay. And the other was of his one of his sisters-in-law, Rosalind Burney Phillip. And given those 2 interior lithographs, I'm supposing that he did not venture out much, or he would have felt compelled, I think, to have done some sketching, some etching of the town itself. So that's it. That's Whistler in Bath. So now we'll go on to the main event, Whistler as dandy. Not to keep you in suspense, but I think Whistler was not a dandy, at least not as he's usually depicted, as you see here. Now, I might ask, though, this might be wise of me before I begin, how many of you think of Whistler in these terms? Raise your hand if you've always thought of Whistler as in this guise. Only a few. Well, that's not bad. I don't have too big a job maybe at hand, but I'll leave it to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as I present my brief. It's not to say that Whistler was not on occasion sort of dandy-ish, if you will, but I think the mistake is to imagine that this was the typical Whistler. I think the problem with images like this is that they exaggerate to an unwarranted extent the pervasiveness in Whistler's life of dandyism. Having said that, I also admit that our definition and our perception of a dandy changes over time and from place to place. You have the sort of stereotypical Beau Brummel on the left, and then the 21st version, 21st century version of the dandy. Now, most attempts to brand Whistler a dandy depend on a definition given by the French poet and essayist Charles Baudelaire, who in an 1863 essay called The Painter of Modern Life. And I should say that Whistler and Baudelaire were acquainted. In fact, Whistler was a great fan of Baudelaire's writings, especially his poetry. But in his essay of 1863, Baudelaire gave a definition of what he considered a dandy to be. And he said this in part: "It is first and foremost a burning need to create for oneself a personal originality. It is a kind of cult of the self. It is a type of revolt, too, a means of combating and destroying triviality." Now, that much does sound like Whistler, but he fails to meet other important parts of Baudelaire's model. For example, Baudelaire goes on to emphasize that dandyism is a way of life, not a cloak to be occasionally worn in public. Baudelaire's dandy is also, quote, rich and idle. a man who's, quote, no other occupation, a man who has no other occupation than the perpetual pursuit of happiness. Baudelaire's dandy must also be blasé, his distinguishing characteristic being an air of coldness, which comes from an unshakable determination not to be moved. Now I ask you, when was the irrepressible Whistler any of those things? So if Whistler was a dandy, when exactly would that have been during the course of his life? For his appearance and behavior changed markedly over the years. For example, this fellow, Arthur Jerome Eddy, whom you see in a portrait painted of him by Whistler in 1894, said this about the artist. Nearly every sketch, drawing, or portrait of Whistler gives some phase of his many-sided personality, but not one, not even those by himself, that is the self-portraits, gives anything like an adequate conception. Perhaps that's why Mortimer Mintz, one of Whistler's earliest, most devoted, and I would say most talented followers, found it impossible in three well-known multi-image dry points, one of which you see here, to settle on a single pose or facial expression for Whistler. Whistler's parents certainly did not rear him to be a dandy. Both George and Anna Whistler were aware of the latest fashions. George, holding important positions in the American railroad business, always dressed as a gentleman. However, both parents were suspicious of fashionable society, what George called the snobs. And surviving images, paintings, and photographs of his son show a neatly dressed young man who seemed destined to emulate the father. The painting you see on the left is a Whistler at the age of 14, and the photograph is probably a year earlier, about the age of 13. Now, not unnaturally, youthful rebellion eroded that early parental influence. And the many demerits that Whistler received as a cadet at West Point for his unkempt appearance and lackadaisical behavior testify to a rebellious streak. And he provides us his own evidence of that rebellious streak. This is a drawing he did as a cadet that shows 4 phases of a cadet standing sentry duty at the academy. At the top left, at the beginning of his watch, you see he's wide awake, alert, ready to challenge anyone who crosses his ground. But gradually, hour by hour, the discipline and the will begin to fade. Now, this rejection of conformity, I guess we'll call it, became more obvious after his dismissal from the academy in 1854. That's when he turned bohemian with, as one friend described it, a leaning toward the style of the artist in the selection of his clothing. And that remained his inclination for at least the next decade, as he embraced the art of a student, first in Paris, where he arrived in 1855, and then later in London, where he finally settled around 1860. Even so, some writers see hints of dandyism even in Whistler's early Paris years, when he was known to wear a suit of white linen duck and a jaunty straw hat. I would say, though, that that uniform, if you will, while seemingly exotic in Paris and London at the time was actually quite common in America, from which he had just come. We do have some images of him during those student days. These are two drawings done by John Edward Poynter, who was a fellow student in Paris, later to make his own name, of course, as a painter. These are two drawings done in 1858 of Whistler. Looks like the straw hat he's wearing at the left. I can't tell if the drawing on the right is that straw hat or some old slouch hat. But you can tell by his posture and the cigarette dangling from his lips that this is someone who's taking life very casually, not embracing it as a way of life, as a dandy might do. When André Fontaine-Latour, another young student in Paris at the time and soon to become a fast friend of Whistler, first saw Whistler at work in the Louvre, copying one of the masterpieces there, he described him as, quote, a strange character wearing a bizarre hat. It's also worth noting, I think, that Anna Whistler, the mother, if you will, lived with her son for the majority of the 1860s and well into the 1870s. And I think you can imagine that any attempt at being a dandy under her watchful eye was not likely to succeed. During those same years, the 1860s and 70s, Benjamin Moran, a member of the US diplomatic legation in London, had occasion to meet other members, Jimmy and other members of the Whistler family as they entered and exited England. And of Jimmy Whistler, he said in 1867, he exhibits a strong dash of the bohemian, but nothing more. And this too from a man, Moran, who was horrified by the appearance and behavior of what he called the, quote, half-formed dandies that he encountered at Cremorne Gardens. This is a watercolor, so you don't have that effect, but it was done by another one of students' youthful followers, Walter Greaves, who has painted himself and his sister into the picture. But he has Whistler standing here, very casually dressed, I would say, and more in that bohemian style. Several scholars have made a case for Whistler's dandyism in the 1860s by pointing to Fontaine-Latour's masterful 1864 painting, Homage to Delacroix. It might almost be called Homage to Whistler, because Fontaine, who considered his friend the leading painter of their generation, places him front and center in this group portrait, insofar as he's nearly a mirror image of the recently deceased Delacroix in the portrait behind him. And insofar as Delacroix was oftentimes considered a dandy in his day, there is perhaps something of that dandyish appeal. I would argue that while made to look perhaps more relaxed, and what's the word I'm looking for? Dignified, more dignified than the people around him. He's not more appreciably dressed. And I might point out some of the other men I'm comparing him to. You have Baudelaire over here. You had Edouard Manet, who is oftentimes also considered a dandy. You have the painter, Fontaine, and Alphonse Lagros, another artist from student days in Paris. Indeed, these three, Whistler, Fontaine-Latour, and Lagros, they were tight. They were thick as thieves. They became best friends in Paris. and form themselves into what they call the Society of Three, pledging themselves personally and artistically to one another. Something like a poor man's pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, if you will. Thomas Carlisle, the sage of Chelsea, and a near neighbor of Whistler for many years along Lindsay Row and Cheney Walk, knew a dandy when he saw one. A year before Whistler was born, and that would have been 1834. Carlisle published one of the first attacks on dandyism in his satirical Sartor Resartus, or The Tailor Retailored. Now, while this book is a complex sort of philosophical musing on a variety of social issues of the day, the dandy's decadent effect on society was chief among Carlyle's concerns, being only slightly removed from the days of the Regency and Beau Brummel. Carlisle ridiculed the dandy as the last vestige of a failed aristocratic order. Now, in that sense, interestingly, Carlyle's perspective on the dandy was the opposite of Baudelaire's, who, rather than denigrating the dandy, praised him as part of a new aristocracy based on intellectual and artistic pursuits, the painter of modern life, rather than social or economic position. And yet both men, to underscore this again, both men thought of dandyism as a way of life. Now, Carlisle was not blind to Whistler's eccentricities, once describing him as, quote, the most absurd creature on the face of the earth. But after sitting for his portrait done in 1872 and 73, Carlisle also came to know Whistler as, quote, a very remarkable person. And for all his suspicions of Whistler's eccentricities, Carlisle never leveled a charge of dandyism against him. The people who knew Whistler best in the 1860s and 70s, and these are two typical photographs of Whistler in the 1860s. In fact, I would say these are typical of every photograph ever taken of Whistler. Okay, keep that in mind. But people who knew him best conceded his self-promotion, his vanity, even his sense of style and fashion. But most of them never associated these traits with dandyism. Lily Langtry, a good friend of those years, found Whistler's appearance, in her words, oddly arresting, with a studied eccentricity in keeping with his whimsical personality. His hereditary tuft of white hair, which he carefully groomed and so was considered part of that dandyish look, was actually mostly gray and barely noticeable until the 1870s. And in any case, Lily considered it simply as weird. That was her word. Other of Whistler's friends thought it, quote, a rallying point of humor. Whistler, they said, had a style all his own. A London neighbor of several years observed, quote, Whistler was unlike anything or anybody else. He was delicate, playful, whimsical, there's that word again, a creature of fancy. Author and journalist Frank Harris said Whistler, quote, retained something particular in his attire, which gave him a certain exotic flavor. He possessed, said Harris, a certain perky distinction. And that's our perky Whistler, also a drawing by Mortimer Mintz. There would seem then, if we discount the 1850s, 60s, and most of the 1870s, there would seem then to be only two narrow periods of time when Whistler might have been considered a dandy. Those would be the late 1870s and the first half of the 1880s. Although interestingly, with a clear break between those two adjacent sets of dates. The 1870s, the late 1870s, were defined as the years of the first Grosvenor exhibition, opened in 1877. The years of the budding aesthetic movement, about which I'll say more. And perhaps most importantly for Whistler, the John Ruskin trial, a result of Whistler suing the esteemed art critic for libel as a result of Ruskin's review of that painting, A Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket. Those of you may recall Ruskin's precise words in reviewing that painting. He said, I never expected to see a coxcomb, which I take to be kind of a degenerate dandy. I never expected to see a coxcomb charge 200 guineas, which is what Whistler was asking for the painting, for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. Well, that's nice alliteration, but you can see why Whistler might have been upset by it. Now, Whistler relished his association with the Grosvenor, which was open in large part to allow young avant-garde artists like himself to display work such as that. But it also linked him to a new precious type of dandyism, personified by the aesthetes and parodied and ridiculed mercilessly in the pages of Punch, often by another one of Whistler's Paris friends from school days, George du Maurier. And here you see an aesthetic couple admiring a piece of Chinese porcelain, which was almost symbolic of the artistic tastes of the aesthetes. Now, it's important to point out that du Maurier never depicted Whistler as part of that crowd. This is a drawing of Whistler by du Maurier in his bohemian garb. However, and not coincidentally, the earliest image of Whistler as a dandy, and the only one that you'll find before the mid-1880s, appeared in the January 1878 issue of Vanity Fair. And it was drawn by another of Whistler's friends, Leslie Ward. And here you have all the hallmarks of what people considered Whistler's dandyism. The white forelock, the monocle, there's the cigarette again, the tight-fitting clothes, patent leather shoes with ribbons as to top them off. In place of a walking stick, he's actually holding an artist's maul stick. I'm not quite sure how that fits into the image of a dandy. I'll let you work that out. Now, Whistler professed to be, quote, very fond, unquote, of this drawing. And yet most of his friends did not think it especially characteristic of him. Even Ward knew that this caricature, even by definition, was an exaggeration. Whistler's outward appearance, Ward said, conveyed nothing more than a surface impression of the man. In any event, this brief phase of Whistler's life ended just a few months later in November of 1878 with the Ruskin trial, with Whistler's subsequent bankruptcy and his subsequent self-imposed exile to Venice, where he hoped to work, restore his reputation, and recoup some money on which to live. And we see nothing of the dandy during his impoverished life in that city. Arthur Pennington, a young American artist, student at the time, who first met Whistler in Venice and became very much attached to him, described this, quote, dreadful year of poverty, that is 1879 to 1880, as a time when the master's clothes, to quote him, were sometimes worn threadbare, actually in holes. Another young artist in the city, another young American artist, Daniel Curtis, having seen Whistler in the Piazza San Marco, described him this way. He wears a little straw hat and is ordinary, and he underlined the word ordinary, is ordinary of looks and speech. Now this drawing is not by Curtis, it's by Richard C. Woodville, and was used as an illustration in the Illustrated London News. But there you see Whistler in that little straw hat. Both Curtis and Pennington must have seen him there. Now there is a painting of Whistler during his Venice years done by Daniel's brother, Ralph Curtis. It shows Whistler at one of the several soirees that he was invited to, mostly by American hostesses in Venice. But as you see, he's simply in an evening dress, dressed as a gentleman. The only sort of eccentricity is the monocle. And regarding the monocle, I would remind you that Whistler was nearsighted. That monocle was actually beneficial, useful to him in being able to see the world more clearly. Well, that leaves the first half of the 1880s, after Whistler's return to London, as probably the most compelling case for a dandified Whistler. These were the years of his vigorous, almost bitter, I would say, rebellion against what he called the Philistines. Whatever his previous eccentricities, he now purposely exaggerated them to outrage bourgeois society and the artistic establishment. He became more combative, more quarrelsome, and absolutely determined to live and work on his own terms. Well, this required a visible change in dress and behavior. The wand, for example, this elongated walking stick, which you see here, is a product of the 1880s. Whistler fancied that this fantastic prop, because of its length, added a dramatic touch, should he wish to point or gesture. One might even say perform with it. It could also be, he realized, a means of intimidation. He once chuckled, "I keep this for the critics." Now, I might note the other two men in the photograph. In the middle is the American painter William Merritt Chase, about whom I'll say more in a moment, with his normal-sized walking stick. And here we finally get to see Mortimer Mintz after seeing examples of his work. Well, having kept his wand for the critics, you can imagine that the critics and the popular press pounced on this new Whistler. While acknowledging Whistler's, quote, capricious talent, the Pall Mall Gazette declared in May of 1882, "We protest against those foppish airs and affectations by which Mr. Whistler impresses on us his contempt of public opinion. For the private view of an 1883 exhibition of his Venice etchings, which Whistler titled An Arrangement in White and Yellow. Whistler wore yellow socks and invited everyone else attending to also don something yellow. If not a yellow shirt, then yellow cravats, yellow flowers, yellow boutonnieres, anything to enliven the carnival effect. One person who did not attend was a teenage Beatrix Potter. Now, young Potter was an avid visitor, let's say, to any exhibition that might be opening in London. But she studiously avoided this one, saying, "It is quite disgusting how people go on about these pre-Raphaelite aesthetic painters." So she has clearly placed Whistler in that aesthetic group. On other occasions during these years, Whistler could be seen wearing an ensemble of lilac gray trousers, a yellow waistcoat with black buttons, and of course that tall, shiny French-style top hat you saw earlier. Now, unfortunately, these changes I've described also linked Whistler to Oscar Wilde's exaggerated brand of aestheticism. Consequently, he, meaning Whistler, suffered more than earlier, more than in the 1860s and 70s, from the abuse being heaped upon the entire aesthetic movement. Aesthetes, declared the Pall Mall Gazette, had not acquired, and I'm quoting, have not acquired their zeal for art out of a genuine love of beauty, but merely out of fashion and a love of display. Well, by 1885, Whistler realized that he had miscalculated in what I'll call this second flirtation with dandyism. He had always resented the suggestion, which is now being heaped upon the aesthetes, that his love of art was anything other than genuine and unconditional. That really had been the cause of the Ruskin trial, to combat the imputation that he and his paintings were shallow, superficial, or lacked depth. So when charges of foppish airs threatened to taint his work, Whistler pulled back, sobered to realize how closely he was now linked to Oscar's excesses. He distanced himself from Wilde and the entire aesthetic movement. At the very least, being associated with Oscar threatened Whistler's ability to control his own public image. And next to Oscar, you see a drawing by the Italian artist Carlo Palladino, another friend of Whistler. And it looks there as though he's almost trying to hide any hint, any sign of dandyism that could be pounced on by the critics. Consequently, William Merritt Chase's famous 1885 portrait of Whistler is not what it seems. The painting does summarize Whistler's popular image in the early 1880s, but two things undermine it as a statement of Whistler's dandyism. First of all, Chase knew the painting, knew the pose, I should say, to be false. He later admitted, even emphasized, that the Whistler of the portrait was, quote, in Chase's words, merely Whistler at play. Chase, like many others, came to know that there were two Whistlers. The public one, with all of his playfulness and what Whistler called his gym cracks, meaning sort of the accessories and eccentricities. And then there was the private man, what Chase called the one genuine Whistler, the serious artist, the tireless slavish worker. Then there's Whistler's own reaction to the painting. He thought the pose a bit of sport at first, as though asking the world, as Chase interpreted it, "You've never taken me seriously. Why should I be serious with you?" However, when Chase subsequently exhibited this painting in America, expressly against Whistler's wishes, and only to have it ridiculed, both the painting and the person, by the critics, Whistler disowned it as a, quote, monstrous lampoon. And let us not forget that this same year, 1885, was the year that Whistler delivered his masterful 10 o'clock lecture, to be followed the following year by his election as the quite respectable, if not controversial, president of the Society of British Artists. And that's a photograph of Whistler in 1885 compared to the Chase painting. Now, I find nothing of the dandy and the 10 o'clock lecture. Quite the opposite. Whistler used that lecture to attack what he called vulgarity in all its forms. And though he never mentioned him by name, the dandified image of Oscar Wilde, who is referred to obliquely as the, quote, gentle priest in the lecture, was at this time the very essence of vulgarity for Whistler, both sartorially and intellectually. The dilettante stalks abroad, Whistler warned the audience, perhaps glancing at Oscar, who was sitting just to his right in the 6th row. Okay. The dilettante stalks abroad. The amateur is loosed. The voice of the aesthete is heard in the land. And catastrophe is upon us, said Whistler. Well, so much for the 1880s. By the 1890s, only the gentleman remained, just as he had dominated, I suggest, all along. Traces of dandyism may be seen in Giovanni Baldini's 1897 portrait, but then Baldini painted everybody that way. Besides that, this is clearly an aging, if not elderly, gentleman, well past the age of at 63 when he sat for this, when he might have been considered a dandy. There's a similarity too between the Baldini portrait and the painting used to advertise this event by Alfred Thompson. But this was done in 1962, simply playing on that traditional image of Whistler. And although it's copied, it's based on an 1897 drawing of Whistler by Paul Hellieu, the same year as the Baldini portrait. I suggest that this is an image more of aristocracy, of a thoughtful, one might even say elder statesman, okay, rather than a dandy. Now, some caricaturists, most notably Max Beerbohm, continued to portray Whistler a dandy well into the 20th century. But most of their work, I think, is not very imaginative. In the case of Beerbohm, you see Whistler lecturing John Ruskin on the aesthetic beauty of Chinese porcelain. But think back to the Leslie Ward 1878 caricature of Whistler. Beerbohm has simply copied it. That's why I call it unimaginative. 25 years earlier, he's bringing that same image forward. Similarly, another Beerbohm caricature. This one showing a party in the garden of Dante Gabriel Rossetti and some of the characters who might have attended. Now, by this was done in 1916. Now, all of these people are long gone by that time, but they do include some interesting characters. You have John Ruskin over here, William Morris holding forth on some socialist track, Edward Burne-Jones, Rossetti, of course, sketching one of his pre-Raphaelite stunners. And again, the Leslie Ward impression of Whistler with Algernon Swinburne, the poet and a friend of Whistler, playfully tugging at that white lock. That despite this 1893 portrait of Whistler in his Paris studio. So what was Whistler playing at? For he surely was playing. I believe that his wildly inconsistent dandyism may be more accurately described as a pose. Understanding the promotional value of keeping himself in the public eye, Whistler helped to create the image of the artist as provocateur, performer, or poser. Most often he did this through his solo exhibitions, such as the arrangement in white and yellow, his Sunday breakfasts, his verbal joust with the critics, his controversial comments about art, his theories about art. But eccentricity of behavior and dress also helped him. Whistler's contemporaries often used the word poser to explain Whistler's behavior and appearance. One person called him, quote, the greatest poser of the day. Arthur Eddy, whom you met earlier, the Chicago attorney, recognizing the, quote, two Whistlers identified by Chase, insisted, and I quote, Whistler was a poser in the sense that he was one man before the public and another in work. Journalist and art critic Theodore Durant, whose portrait by Whistler you see here, and who had been a confidant of Whistler since the 1870s and would be one of the pallbearers at Whistler's funeral, denied, I should say, that Whistler was, quote, a mere man of fashion. Rather, Durant said, his friend, quote, combined the manners of a gentleman with the pose and fantastic getup of the artist. The question is, can a gentleman be a dandy? It would seem not, at least according to Baudelaire and Carlisle and other experts on the subject. Even Max Beerbohm, who wrote an essay in 1896 about dandyism, said that Whistler only, quote, wished to be a dandy, unquote. Well, then does eccentricity of dress or behavior disqualify one as a gentleman? Possibly, if the eccentricity is erratic, vulgar, or irrational. But what if the eccentricity is itself a pose? Because that's where we stand with Whistler. Remember, being a dandy is serious business. It's a way of life and taken seriously by men who wish to be so known. Whistler's extravagances were staged. Harper Pennington, whom you met earlier, acknowledged a, quote, certain dandified attitude in the master. But he also emphasized that that was, quote, an assumed identity. The insightful art critic, J. Commons Carr, not in a sketch by Whistler, insisted that the, quote, impishly militant Whistler took a childish delight in any little studied departure from the rules of ordinary costume. This might include, Carr said, the very undandy combination of white duck trousers and a black frock coat. This is another of a collage by Mortimer Mintz. But there was far more to Whistler than that, said Carr. While Whistler at times exhibited, quote, a strange blend of the man of genius and the showman, no one, as man or artist, was more exacting in the demands he made upon himself. There was, said Carr, quote, nothing of the charlatan in Whistler. Well, I'll let Mortimer Mintz, who, as you see, also absorbed the Asian influence from Whistler, have the final word. Whistler's mode of dress, he insisted, was consistent to his artistic conceptions. It was always the artist who talked, and not the vain man of fashion. Now I let Mintz have the final word. Let me show you one more image. That's a monotype of Whistler, done by another of his young American followers he met in Venice, done in 1880. It shows Whistler at work, sketching, drawing, who knows. But this is the image that his followers, the people who knew him best, the one genuine Whistler, as Chase described him. And that's why I think this is the very best portrait of Whistler ever made. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have I made my case? Yeah, time for questions, yes.
One question I would address that, and then it would be the online question here, I guess. No, it's not working.
Only if you heard them.
Anyway, if you have any questions you want to ask Daniel?
And please do.
Please do.
You're locked in for another 15 minutes. So yes, ma'am.
Great thing. How was he viewed as through his childhood and adolescence? Was he always seen as someone with huge talent?
Oh, yeah.
Was he given confidence in his talent as a young man? So, or as a young boy going through. So as he arrived as a young man, he was supremely sure of his talent. And it must have been incredibly annoying to have all these critics popping away. And you are a genius.
Yes. Now that talent was recognized early on. The Whistler family lived in St. Petersburg, Russia, during Whistler's teenage years, or the first half of his teenage years. And he was allowed to take lessons at the Imperial Academy of Art, where he learned to draw. A British painter passing through St. Petersburg at the time the Whistlers were there was invited to the Whistler home. And Anna Whistler, the mother, wanted to show him some of the young Whistler's drawings. I mean, this is age 12, 13. And he was impressed and said that, encouraged Anna to allow him to have free reign to express himself in that way. And Anna said, well, yes, but this is just a hobby, you understand. We're not encouraging him to be a professional artist. He was encouraged by his father to be an engineer. After his father died, his mother and his uncles got together and decided that perhaps the best place for him would be West Point. But he had further training in art at West Point, in watercolors and in drawing. So before he ever went to Paris to become an artist, he had multiple talents. He also worked in Washington, D.C. for 2 months, maybe, in the topographical department, drawing maps for the government, which is where he actually learned to do etching at that time. So yes, he was full of confidence, He enrolled in an art school in Paris, but after the first 2 weeks, he was rarely seen in the studio. He believed that he could learn nothing formally any longer, and so spent most of his time in the Louvre, copying masterpieces. You mentioned him as being a masterful painter. His greatest strength, a lot of people believe, and certainly the way he made his first money as an artist was through his etching. Some people compared him, or I think it was William Rossetti, in fact, said that Whistler was the greatest etcher since Rembrandt. And that also then transferred to lithography when he spread his wings and moved in that direction. So there's never any doubt in Whistler's mind that he was prepared for greatness. And so he did resent the critics, especially. I mean, there's a long running war between Whistler and the critics, which came out fully and most full blown in his dispute with Ruskin. In fact, he wrote a pamphlet after the Ruskin trial, attacking the whole British system of art criticism, saying that critics knew nothing about art, that the only people who were capable of critiquing his work were other artists. Do I believe that? I'm not an artist, so I'd be hesitant to, I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? Okay. And the fact, I guess, that artists, well, you could say that artists, though, would be hesitant to really critique one another. It's like authors in writing a book review. You don't want to be too hard on that author because he might be writing the next review about your book, you see. You see, I could give you another lecture about Whistler's reputation for quarrelsome, because I think that's overblown too. Whistler selected his quarrels. Well, Whistler was selective in picking his quarrels. And it was they almost always had something to do with a point of honor. Either he or a friend was personally insulted, or his art was insulted and mischaracterized. And I think if you look at all of his most celebrated quarrels, they all had something to do with that. So he's not going around willy-nilly just picking fights with people. Okay? He's very selective in who he's going to pillory. Yes.
At the same time, with his parents saying you should be an engineer, you should go to West Point, etc., while you might have a certain amount of self-confidence, that also breeds, surely, through a long time, a need to say, but yes, to demonstrate a bit more. Don't give me this engineer stuff. Look, this is what I really am.
Yeah.
And needing to manifest it. And therefore, choosing somewhat outlandish clothing, say, would be a way of saying, look, Mum, you know, I mean it. While you say self-confidence, there's always that tension, I think.
Yeah.
With the growing up background.
It's interesting. Whistler's father died in 1849 when Whistler was in England going to school, actually at Portishead, very near Bristol. It's in that exchange of letters that Whistler's father is saying he would like to see his son go to university, that he could make a good name for himself as an engineer, perhaps as an architect. And in Whistler's response, excuse me, now he's 14 years old, he tells his father, but what I really want to do is be an artist. Okay? Others have been artists before me, father. I think I could be a good one. And his father died before he could reply. So I think there was always that hunger to be an artist. And then when he broke out, when he was dismissed from the academy, the idea of adopting the dress and the behavior of what he considered the artistic world, the artistic milieu, that was sort of a natural separation. There was that initial rebellion against his parents' conformity and looking like a little gentleman. And he received, he nearly broke all records for demerits at West Point. Demerits are the black marks against you for having an untidy uniform, an unclean rifle, going to sleep on guard duty, that sort of thing. So he was ready to rebel. But then in going to Paris, that rebellion was channeled into his desire to be an artist. The gentleman in the back, I think early on, wanted to ask.
He was very influential, no doubt about it. Do you think it's Dante's influenced Sickert, who had the same potential for changing his identity every so often?
Yeah, and Walter Greaves too. And you saw the picture of Pennington, for example. Part of the baggage you carried and being a follower of Whistler is that you felt compelled to mimic him in everything, including dress. So you saw Walter Greaves in the top hat and the gentleman's clothes. And there's something of that in Sickert as well. I think Sickert had a background similar to Whistler, where he was sort of destined to be a gentleman. But then as an artist, he gave himself freer rein in that. And it was an interesting relationship between Sickert and Whistler. Sickert outlived all the other of Whistler's early followers. I think he didn't die until the 1930s. And he was writing pieces about Whistler all through Whistler died in 1903. And Sickert is writing pieces about Whistler all through the teens, the 20s, up until the time of his death. And he gradually begins to find the need to criticize Whistler in some areas. He criticizes etching technique, he criticized his use of paint and so on and so forth. But he never abandoned him as a master. And so you have to assume that Whistler remained that model for Sickert, both sartorially, both artistically throughout his life. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, this is a wonderful painting. I just love his work. But I just wonder how he would feel if he knew we were sitting discussing his dandyism instead of his painting. I mean, so many artists dress up. It is a way of, advertising oneself. You have to think of Grace and Perry. I mean, do we admire him because he dresses up, or do we like his work? But
and it's also, I think, an expression of personality, rather just
yes. But how would he feel about people discussing his clothes rather than his painting?
What he would. So what?
I was just going to interject that Grace and Perry uses the same technique that Whistler, what you illustrated in your talk. It's a way of getting attention.
Yeah.
So yes. Grace and Perry uses the same thing. So he wouldn't mind us doing it. He loves it.
Probably Whistler would prefer us to talk about painting rather than the fact that he's wearing yellow socks.
Oh, the people online can't hear? What do we? Oh, so we need to repeat the questions. Yes. We assume there were people online. So you. Yes. Yeah, how would people feel about emphasizing the way Whistler dressed, his attire, rather than his painting. And you're quite right. He believed his paintings should speak for him. You know his book, The Gentle Art of Making Enemies, which were excerpts from all of his newspaper, mostly his newspaper quips, plus a partial transcript from the Ruskin trial, the various pamphlets he had made. He had always said that this was his autobiography. If you want to know about me when I'm gone, then this is what you look at. It's interesting to note that when he died, his surviving work and all of his correspondence were placed in the hands of Rosalind Burney Phillip, the young sister-in-law, with express orders that none of the correspondence be published. Okay. Now, it has subsequently been published, but only after Rosalind Burney Phillip's death in 1958. But the idea, what Whistler had in mind, is that he didn't want that to be used to exploit or to explore his past. Okay. The paintings, the etchings were to stand, or to create and maintain his legacy, his reputation. In fact, he was noted for destroying work that didn't live up to his standards, that he thought might embarrass him after he had died. He famously said, "To destroy is to survive." So I think you're quite right. But it's also unfair to think that we shouldn't be interested in the things outside the paintings, because I think they do help us to understand, in some cases, motivation or why he approaches art the way he does, why he took the paths in life that he did. So I can come back and speak about the paintings on another occasion, if you like. At the moment, I'm writing a book about Whistler's legacy. I mean, that's essentially the title. Looking at the rise and fall of his reputation since he died in 1903, up until essentially 2020 will be the cutoff line. And this talk is going to be one of those chapters, simply exploring some of the, what I consider the myths or the legends that seem to have clung to Whistler long after he was gone. The same with the idea of being quarrelsome. Okay. And then chapters on how the critics have viewed him since that time, how the exhibitions of his work have been received, what biographers have said about him, the rise and fall of prices for his work, etchings, paintings, and so on. So there's a lot about Whistler that we need to try to understand about his life after he had passed on. No, I wouldn't dare. Well, you're suggesting we should psychoanalyze him? Yeah. Is that fair when the patient isn't there to respond to your questions? But that's our interpretation of him. I guess what I'm saying, I'm very leery of psychoanalyzing someone who's been dead for so long. Even a psychologist has the patient there to ask questions to and receive the responses. Okay, so what you're asking me to do is to anticipate or to guess what the responses might be. Okay. Now I know art historians do that all the time. I mean, but because I'm not an art historian, but a biographer, I'm going to steer clear of that. I like to go by what I find in the correspondence, in not just of Whistler, but of the people who knew Whistler, in their diaries, in their memoirs. That's what I've been quoting from mostly tonight, the reminiscences and memoirs of people who knew Whistler. Okay? They were the ones who essentially were psychoanalyzing him at the time. They didn't know it, okay? But they were trying to understand him in similar terms. So I'd rather go by their accounts than kind of speculate. That's right. Yeah.
In a way, I would say that you need to try and imagine perhaps fill in there some of those.
And we know that Rosalind did destroy some of the correspondence she thought might embarrass him in later life. I suspect that had to do with lady friends, things of that sort. But that's speculation, you see.
And when I saw the title of this lecture, it made me think, well, what compare with a real dandy? And the only person I could think of was the one who, and I can't think of the name, was the one who was the model both for the Proust character in Proust, and I think one in G, you know, the famous parrot in the Proust things. And I saw a painting of him once, and I think his whole life was devoted to being, to acting this character, this person who didn't produce anything except an impression. And if you could find a real dandy, then you could make it clearer that somebody who did and produced so much of serious stuff wasn't just in society and trying to mold society, social intercourse the way he wanted.
Yeah.
You know, so you have the same question about Oscar Wilde. How much was real dandyism and how much was damn hard work?
Yeah, I think you could make a case that Oscar wasn't really a dandy, but because Oscar was more willing to accept that role, and because Whistler and being associated with him was receiving the same sort of attacks that Wilde did, he distanced himself. Now, there's another problem with the Whistler-Wilde connection. I said that Whistler was attacking Wilde's vulgarity, both sartorially and intellectually. Wilde became known for his lectures on art, both in Britain and in a famous tour of the United States he took. And much of what he said were based on Whistler's ideas and conversations he had had with Whistler. So Whistler began to feel as though his words and his ideas were being stolen by Wilde. He accused Wilde of plagiarism. And it was that as much as the physical resemblance that caused Whistler to turn his back on Wilde.
Well, I wanted to mention that Daniel has brought his biography along, and I'd be happy to sign it for you. You have purchased it this evening. And also we have information about the Whistler Society. And I think I said ever so briefly that Whistler was one of the founding members. And whether or not he was a dandy, he certainly had the charisma that we all admire. The Chelsea Arts Club has that reputation of the genre vivre that he inspired in all of us, I think. So that would be great. And the Whistler Society, we meet regularly. We have a committee that planning some wonderful events. We have some online events. We have a seance with Mr. Whistler. You think that's back to life. We celebrate his birthday every July. And this time we're going to focus on Paris. That's when you think of Paris. In his days in Paris, and he had the art studio called the Carmen Studio, and he seemed to prefer the ladies, actually, you told me. I think that's true. He seemed to circulate around the ladies too.
He thought the ladies were more teachable than the men were.
And so there you are. Ladies. So there's lots of information over there. And thank you, Daniel. It was absolutely wonderful.
My pleasure.
Thanks for coming. So if you want to go over this table, and your dad is in Arkansas. He's only here until mid-May. So he's on his research or his other his new I should have mentioned that he's also the co-author of Whistler's Mother. So there you are. So that was another. We'll talk about Anna another time. That's your next step.
Okay.
The influences of Anna.